I want to shift our focus over to what we're seeing on the pandemic front here, as we are seeing cases rise. That has been the trend here in the US. More than 52,000 cases were reported yesterday. As hospitalizations as well continues to tick higher, we've seen the highest net hospitalizations number since August 29th. So that is also moving in the wrong direction and at a quickening pace. Across the pond, though, new cases in the EU have now surpassed new cases here in the US, demonstrating the resiliency of the virus amidst easing restrictions and stoking fears of what could be ahead for us here in the US this winter. Italy, I should note, today reported more than 7,000 new positive COVID-19 tests. That broke the prior record for most infections added in a single day back in March, when Italy was one of the first countries to really start locking down in this pandemic. So for more on this and the trends we're seeing play out, I want to bring on our next guest. Dr. Cedric Dark is assistant professor at Baylor College of Medicine and a board member with Doctors for America. And Dr. Dark, I appreciate you taking the time to chat with us here. First, just want to get your reaction to what we're seeing play out in the EU right now, because a lot of people are watching that and very fearful of what's to come here in the winter months. Talk to me about how you're looking at that and what it means for all of us here.
I think what we see across the pond is similar to what we've seen a lot of times in the States when governments have relaxed a little bit with their COVID restrictions. And we've seen numbers go up. We've seen this happen in Texas, where I am. We've seen it happen in Florida. We're seeing it happening in Europe now. And, there's a lot of people that are looking at how should the world go about this. One of the ways in which certain countries have gone about it has been sort of the Swedish way, where you try to achieve herd immunity, in which case they actually have one of the highest death rates since the pandemic began. Around 58 people die per 100,000, which is just slightly below what we're doing in the United States, where we're about 65 per 100,000. Somehow we've managed to do it even worse than a country that's tried to use herd immunity as its only strategy. And then you see what happens on the other end of that spectrum when you talk about countries like New Zealand, who are very strict and are now in a position where they can go out freely without having to worry about the virus, because they've essentially eliminated it from their island.
Yeah, it's a good point. And I mean, it's something we've discussed here too, because a lot of people point to the trade-off of, oh, do you want the economy to go completely to zero? But even in that case, we highlighted the University of Copenhagen study that was looking into consumer spending in a country like Sweden that completely stayed open versus a Denmark. And even there, only about 4 percentage points of difference in terms of consumer spending across those two countries, 25% versus 29%, which kind of shows that it's the consumer fears that's still keeping people. You can open up, but whether or not that fear is going to, make them stay home, that's another question entirely. And I want to ask about the medical progresses, though, that we've seen, because obviously you can compare back to March, but people are still saying that mortality rates have come down, hospitalizations have come down, and that might be in piece because of what we're hearing from President Trump talking about some of the treatment he got, saying that he's going to continue to push for emergency use approval of Regeneron's drug. We saw Eli Lilly's antibody cocktail trial there paused over some potential safety concerns. So talk to me about the medical risks right now making their way through these trials when we think about the antibody cocktails that he seems to be such a strong proponent of.
I think one of the main things that the public needs to remember is that the purpose of any pharmaceutical company and for the Food and Drug Administration in terms of approving a regimen is to, number one, make sure that it is safe for people. Number two, to make sure it's actually effective. And we don't want to rush any of that. And so we need to let science work the process, so that when we see new antibody cocktails coming about, like the Lilly cocktail, if there is something going wrong with it in the research process, they halt the trial or they pause the trial. You only stop trials for typically one of three reasons. Either we know that it's working, so that doing anything further, randomizing people to no treatment, would be unethical. That's one reason. A second reason would be if after recruiting a lot of people, there's no effect and we find out that the treatment is futile. And then the third reason is what happened with Lilly, such that if there is harm, we need to stop. We need to figure out what the harm is due to. Was it actually due to the drug, due to something else? And once that's determined, continue with the scientific process.
Yeah, and so we're going to watch those. It's again, it comes in the wake of some other trials getting paused there as well. We talked about J&J also pausing their vaccine candidate trial, as well as AstraZeneca's being paused for similar reasons there too. But I also wanted to ask you about some of the cases that we've seen reported here in the U.S. tied back to political rallies, because of course President Trump is now back on the campaign trail. And interesting to see reports out of Minnesota there, where state officials said that some cases were tied back to political rallies. The number 16 cases, they say, linked to an outdoor Trump event at an airport in Bemidji earlier in September, as well as a couple cases tied to Biden events that campaign disputed, since they didn't actually have events on the days they were reported. But regardless, it does seem like there are risks tied to these things, especially the indoor events, as we talked about yesterday, being hosted in Wisconsin by the president's son. What do you make of those rallies still being held, and the risks as a doctor that you see playing out here?
I think a lot of this is reckless behavior to bring a lot of people into close contact with folks outside of their home bubbles, especially if you're not going to have them wearing masks. And let's be clear about this. Donald Trump is the super spreader in chief. Whether or not he himself is infecting individuals, by him holding large rallies, bringing lots of people together, it sets up a situation where folks, just like what happened in Minnesota, are going to demonstrate that the infection will continue to brew and to pass from one individual to another. When you look at the folks that actually contracted the virus and were traced back, 22 of 24 infected individuals were traced back to attending Donald Trump rallies. 2 of the 24 were from possibly Biden rallies. And as you said, one of those 2 was contested by the Biden campaign because they weren't having a rally at that time. If our candidates are going to continue having rallies, they need to do a couple of things. Number 1, it needs to be outdoors. Number 2, everyone needs to wear masks. Number 3, they need to have social distancing. And, I know how much politicians want to have the image of a packed house. This is just not the time for that.
Lastly, Doctor, just to kind of put a pin on what we saw there, since I think a lot of people were kind of surprised to see Italy surpass the daily case count that they posted back in March. That's kind of terrifying to think about when you see what potential could happen here, and how much worse we were after March. This same thing that people do point to, though, is the fact that deaths and hospitalization have lagged, and that's to be expected, since it takes a while for cases to present themselves, symptoms to present themselves. So what are you seeing now as we move past the 50,000 case count here daily in the U.S., and what you forecast for the winter months ahead?
We're still seeing cases. They have slowed down from our peaks, especially here in Texas from June, July. But cases are still out there. And the problem that we really have is we still have this mentality that we can just go about our lives like normal. And in fact, recently, the Trump administration has, people inside the Trump administration have offered a strategy of trying to achieve herd immunity, which honestly, I don't think Donald Trump is trying to achieve herd immunity. He's trying to thin the herd. And the reason he's trying to do that is because we know that this virus impacts Black people, Latinx populations, the Native populations, working class people far more than it does other groups of individuals. And my fear is that as we move further, not only with this pandemic, but also into flu season, that those communities are going to be adversely impacted more than others.
Yeah, that has been the trend, at least in terms of which communities have been hit the hardest through the first few months of dealing with this pandemic. We'll see what happens, but hopefully the cases do not spike like what we're seeing across the pond. But appreciate you taking the time to chat with us. Dr. Cedric Dark, assistant professor at Baylor College of Medicine and a board member with Doctors for America. Thanks again. Be well.
Hey investors, Zach Guzman here. Are you interested in learning more about the markets and getting the latest financial news? Well, then click right here to subscribe to our Yahoo Finance YouTube channel. Get the latest up-to-the-minute market analysis, big interviews in the world of finance, and information on how to manage your money every day wherever you are.